Hello everyone, I've got another video for y'all. For the past month and a half, I've been in rural Illinois on vacation, and while I was up there, I found this buffet on Facebook Marketplace for $80. I've always been curious to see what it would be like to paint something outside of my normal environment, so I went ahead and grabbed this piece, brought it back to my buddy's house. He was kind enough to let me use his workspace while I worked on this project. The buffet itself is in pretty good condition. It's pretty dirty, so this is all going to need to be cleaned up before I start painting anything. One of the first things I do when I get started on any project is remove the hardware from the drawers and set them aside. Since this piece has doors, I'll be removing them, the hinges, and all the hardware that comes with them. All of the pulls and the screws that go with them will get placed into a Ziploc bag, and the door hinges and all the screws that come with those will get their own bag to keep everything separate. Before I remove any hinges, I'll mark them so that I know where they go when it comes time to put everything back together. This could save you a lot of headaches in the future because on some older pieces, hinges are bent from years of use and abuse, and sometimes the hinges were fitted that way whenever the piece was built. Now that everything is taken apart and set aside, I can start cleaning this thing down. I used a little bit of Dawn dish soap, added some water, dipped the towel in the water, and gave everything a good scrubbing. You always want to be sure that the surface you're about to paint is as clean as possible. Any dirt or grime that you don't clean up could interfere with your paint finish in a variety of different ways. It's usually better to clean your project before you start sanding. That way all of this doesn't gum up your sandpaper and cost you more money in the long run. With everything cleaned up, I moved the drawers and doors to the side so they don't get damaged while I started sanding the body of the buffet. To sand this project, I'm using a Surf Prep 3x4 sander that I recently got. The purpose of sanding before you paint is to give the paint a better surface to adhere to. If you see while I'm sanding, the glossy finish turns into a cloudy finish. This is what you're looking for whenever you're sanding something in preparation for paint. You don't really want to sand all the way down to the wood because doing so it exposes your paint to the possibility of bleeds, which happen when the water-based paint interacts with the oils in the wood. A cool way that this sander prevents that are the foam sanding pads that conform to the edges of whatever you're sanding. This prevents oversanding and could prevent a lot of bleeds. This is my first time using this sander to prep any project, so I'll keep using this sander on my future projects and let y'all know in future videos what I think about it. With the sanding complete, all I needed to do was one final wipe down with a damp rag to remove any remaining dust before I start painting. The paint I ended up using for this project was from Clark Kensington from a local hardware store. I was looking for more of a true black. I got this Midnight Stroll. The brush I'm using to paint this project is one of my old Lenser Best brushes from Walmart. Whenever I'm using a brush, I like to paint in thin coats so I can get the least amount of brush strokes as possible. Brush strokes aren't necessarily a bad thing, it's just personal preference. On this project, it was beneficial for me to use thin coats because the humidity was ridiculously high, which extends the amount of time it takes for the paint to dry. If I was to paint in thicker coats, it would take several hours for this paint to dry. Even painting in these thin coats, I had to wait about 45 minutes to an hour before I could come back and apply another coat. I ended up doing 4 coats of paint on this project. I did not sand in between each coat, but if you ever feel like you have too many brush strokes and want your finish to be smoother, take some 220 grit sandpaper, sand the brush strokes out, and then come back with a final thin coat. While I waited for the top to dry, I finished off the sides and the front of the buffet. The cabinets originally had these shelves inside, but I took them out because I didn't want to have to paint around them. That left me with these holes that I needed to fill. I didn't have any wood filler on hand, but I did find this fast drying caulk, so I put a little caulk in the holes and finished up the drawers while I waited for it to firm up. Once it was dry enough, I used a razor blade to cut the caulk level with the wood and then finished painting the cabinet so I can move on to the next step. Part of my original plan for this piece was to do some light distressing around the edges of the tops and drawers in hopes that the lighter color would contrast well with the black that I painted on top. However, this black turned out to be more of a gunmetal color, so my original plan, especially the handles, didn't look like it was going to happen. Luckily, I had packed some of this Dixie Belle silver gilding wax, and with this gunmetal tone, I felt like this would be the perfect opportunity to use it. I like to apply this wax with a sponge when I'm working with larger areas and my finger whenever I want to highlight smaller areas. When you're applying this wax, it's okay if you get a little bit sloppy. What I like to do is come back with some mineral spirits in a rag and wipe off the wax from the areas where it looks sloppy to give everything some nice clean lines. Once I had the top highlighted and was happy with it, I moved on to the drawers and repeated the same process. After the drawers were complete, I moved on to the base of the buffet, applying more silver as I went along. I probably went a little too heavy on the legs here, but it's okay. With the majority of the silver done other than the doors, I took a step back to make sure I liked how everything looked. Looked good to me, so I moved on to my top coat. To do that, I'm going to be using this Minwax polyacrylic in a semi-gloss finish. This is a water-based polyurethane, and I applied it with this Lenser brush. Applying polyurethane with a brush is kind of similar to applying paint in thin coats, except that you don't want to go back and mess with it after you've applied it. Doing so increases your chance of getting brush strokes in your finish, which can be corrected by sanding with a fine grit sandpaper and reapplying more of your top coat. But in the long run, it's better just to apply your polyurethane, leave it alone, and move on. The first few coats are going to look a little sloppy, but you're going to come back with some fine grit sandpaper in between coats to knock down any of the imperfections in brush strokes, and each subsequent coat from that point on should give you a nice finish. After my second coat, I used this sanding pad because it's what I had on hand to knock down all of the brush strokes and get the finish as smooth as possible. Smoothing everything out before you apply your last few coats of polyurethane allows these coats to lay down a lot better without interference from your brush strokes, which usually results in a good finish. After I wiped off the dust, I used this sponge applicator and some pantyhose to apply my final coat. The pantyhose helps smooth everything out whenever you're applying polyurethane with a sponge. Because the top was so big and the weather was so hot, I was having issues with brush strokes when I was doing the top. So I opted to use this method instead. It worked out a little better. I think in the right conditions, it could have been better. I also sanded the sides before I gave them their final coat. Vertical surfaces tend to be easier to work on than the horizontal surfaces like the top because gravity does a lot of the work in smoothing everything out. I repeated the same process on the front of the buffet, the cabinets, and the drawers. In the end, everything was looking pretty good, but I noticed this bristle that got stuck in the finish. This came from my paintbrush. If something like this happens to you, all you need to do is take your fine grit sandpaper, sand out your blemishes, get everything smooth, and reapply your top coat. The doors were the last thing that needed top coat, so I knocked those out, added some silver to them, and I was ready to start on getting this thing put back together. For the hardware, I used this Rust-Oleum hammered silver spray paint. I applied 3 coats, flipping and rotating the hardware as I needed. After a few hours, the paint was dry enough for me to go ahead and start mounting everything. I put the hinges back in their original positions and didn't have a lot of problems with the doors other than some minor adjustments. With everything put back together, I took it off of the paint can so we could get a good look at it. It definitely wasn't what I had in mind, using a true black and distressing the edges, but I think it came out pretty sleek looking. I'm pretty happy with it. Painting in a different environment, especially a humid one like this with flies everywhere, was definitely a challenge for me. I don't use polyurethane by hand very often, and using it on black is very difficult, so I learned a lot of things on this project. Let me know down in the comments what you think about this video. I hope it helps you out in some way. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell so you get notifications whenever I upload new videos. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see y'all again soon.